Hello, my name's David Booty and I'm the head of R&D at OMEX Fertilisers. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is the topic of urease inhibitors, ammonia emissions, and a new product, NitroShield from OMEX, which addresses that. So I'm going to go into some detail about why ammonia emissions are important and what we're doing about it. So as background then, why is ammonia a problem? Because it's actually not a greenhouse gas. This isn't to do with carbon footprint or atmospheric greenhouse warming. Ammonia is a straightforward pollutant. So an atmospheric ammonia pollution is increasing and has been doing over the last few years. So although we're in line with government targets for 2020, what we've got is a steadily decreasing target for ammonia emissions. And if we stay as we are, we're unlikely to hit that. Consequently, that's the cause of government concern. And ammonia directly affects human health. So it's quite harmful to people who've already got existing lung conditions, for instance. And it's environmentally damaging because it circulates through the atmosphere quite quickly. It can come down as available nitrogen in rainfall, which is fine if it lands on your arable field and that's free N for your crop. But if it obviously lands on a sensitive woodland or heathland area or a watercourse, that is then an environmental problem. And the great majority of UK ammonia emissions come from agriculture, something like 87%. So this isn't industrial pollution, it's coming from the way we farm. So that's why agriculture is the focus of DEFRA efforts to try and reduce ammonia emissions. And looking at where that ammonia actually comes from, the great bulk of it is from animal manure, grazing animals themselves or housed animals. And that is being addressed by government. They are bringing in regulations on the use of slurries, covering stores and so on to try and reduce that. But fertiliser still makes a significant contribution. And in many ways, the fertiliser issue is easier to address. So that's why it's come to the fore for new rules on how to use fertilisers. And looking at emissions by fertiliser type, well, all nitrogen fertiliser has the potential to release ammonia to the atmosphere, but the biggest risk is from granular urea or from UAN, liquid nitrogen, which is 50% urea, 50% ammonium nitrate. Between the two of those, they're well over half of the total emissions. So that has been the focus for mitigation from the government point of view. And the problem is about an enzyme that's in the soil called urease. This is a ubiquitous enzyme. It's not a living thing. It's produced by plants. It's produced by microbes. And the reason it's there is to help plants obtain available nitrate from urea. And urea does occur in nature. It's formed in thunderstorms and it's also in animal urine. So this is a process that's always been happening since long before we had artificial fertilizers. And urease is ubiquitous in all types of soil everywhere. Now, that's not a problem. That's not necessarily a problem because we want urease to break down urea fertilizer to make it available to plants in any case. So that's a good thing. Where it becomes a problem is if the fertilizer sits on the soil surface in warm, dry conditions, instead of mixing in the soil, and then you can get a process of the release of ammonia gas, which goes into the atmosphere. Whereas if that fertilizer is washed into the soil, then it tends to form ammonium, which is broken down by soil microbes into nitrate. So that's the process we want to happen. But where urea is applied in warm, dry conditions, then it can volatilize. And that's a particular risk also on high pH soils. So not just warm and dry, but if you've got a pH higher than 7, that process tends to happen more quickly. Now, what happened was a couple of years ago, the government put out some headlines saying because of this issue, they were minded to ban the use of urea. The industry fairly quickly went back to Whitehall and said, we don't want you to do that. That would have unintended consequences. And what happened is that the fertilizer industry, the NFU, and other interested parties got together and came up with a voluntary standard for us to use, as opposed to the government bringing in firm legislation. So this will be administered for farmers in England by the Red Tractor Standard. It's called option 4 because there were other options considered before that. And it applies from the 1st of April 2024. So from spring this year, any fertilizer containing more than 1% urea that's applied to soil after the 1st of April will have to have a urease inhibitor with it to mitigate ammonia emissions, unless it's incorporated or there's other mitigating circumstances. The rules in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales are all different. They all have their own local administrations. But I'm going to talk about the situation in England. So we were faced with an issue that we hadn't previously been routinely using urease inhibitors with liquid fertilizer. So we needed to answer some questions about what's the best material to use, when would you use it, what's the real risk, how effective are they, all of these things to make sure we give good advice to farmers. And to do field trials where you measure ammonia emissions is extremely difficult, expensive. There was no prospect of us turning all that work around within 2 years to give the answers to all the questions we had. So what we did was an awful lot of lab testing. We built our own kit according to recognized standards that are used throughout Europe to measure ammonia emissions from soil treated with fertilizers and treated with inhibitors. So we tested a wide range of inhibitors, different types of fertilizer to see what answers we got. Because although there's been a lot of work done with solid fertilizers, there's been very little done with liquid. So the process is that you have soil in a flask, you pass air over the top of that, you capture the air coming out of the flask that's got any released ammonia in it, you pass that through an acid bath, dissolve the ammonia, and then at the end of the experiment, you can measure how much nitrogen has found its way into that acid from the soil. That gives you your ammonia losses. And the standard is that you run that test for 14 days. It's fairly short term because within a few days, even in just humid conditions, never mind rainfall, any fertilizer on the soil surface is going to percolate into the soil. So the main risk of loss is in the first few days after application. And what we did was compare a whole range of different inhibitors. There were papers written about acidifying agents, ammonium thiosulfate, zinc, alternative inhibitors. We tried all of those with liquid nitrogen, but really, to be honest, it was a one-horse race. There is an established inhibitor known by the short name of NBPT, been around a long time. It's been used in the United States on solid urea for at least 20 years. And that was the only one which really gave routine significant reductions in ammonia emissions. And it's important to bear in mind here that DEFRA have a declared target to reduce the emissions from urea fertilizers by 70%. And as you can see, there was only one of those inhibitors that actually did that. So NitroShield from OMEX is based on this NBPT ingredient. How does that work? Well, basically the inhibitor presents two amide bonds to the urease enzyme. That's what the enzyme is looking for in urea, two amide bonds. It bonds onto those and then breaks down the urea. So what the inhibitor does is basically occupy the enzyme, tie it up so it can't interact with urea. And that only lasts for a short time because the inhibitor breaks down. So the urease does become available to digest urea, and that's exactly what you want it to do in order to turn it into nitrate. You just don't want that to happen too quickly on the soil surface. So the inhibitor that is there for a short period of time, locking up that urease to give time for the urea fertilizer to get into the soil. Now, if I showed you the volatilization equipment we have, it's clear liquid bubbling away in glass jars, so nothing to see here. This isn't that equipment, but this is a demonstration of how that works. And I'll just run this video so that we can... In this demonstration, filmed over 4 days, 4 closed flasks containing the same amount of soil are untreated, treated with urea granules, OMEX NitroFlow liquid, or NitroFlow with the OMEX inhibitor added. The indicator tubes at the top of each flask react to the presence of ammonia by turning blue, with the level reached showing the amount of ammonia released. As can be seen, the ammonia released from the liquid nitroflow is less than half of that from urea granules, but adding the inhibitor reduces this by more than 70%. Now, the interesting thing that came out of that work, besides the fact that NitroShield was very effective in reducing ammonia emissions, was that the emissions from liquid nitrogen themselves were lower than expected. So liquid UAN is about 50% urea. So the expectation, and this is what government models are based on, is that it'll emit about half as much ammonia as granular urea, pure urea. In point of fact, all the testing we've done has repeatedly shown that, in fact, the emissions from UAN are about 30% or a third of what you get from granular urea. So actually, the fact that it's a liquid, to some extent, mitigates ammonia emissions. So why might that be? Well, here's a very easy demonstration of that. This is basically a box of soil, and on the left-hand side, the 4 drops of UAN have been applied. On the right-hand side, 4 granules of granular urea. This, within 1 minute of application, you can see that because the UAN is a water-based solution, it's soaked into the soil, whereas the granules are sitting on top, and that's bone-dry soil. Now, over time, what will happen is that those, and you can see that happening here, those granules will pick up moisture from the atmosphere because they're hygroscopic, and they will percolate into the soil as well. But obviously, it happens a lot more quickly with the liquid nitrogen. That's why we're seeing lower emissions, even though it's half urea. So this graph on the right-hand side shows an average of all the results we've had from all those experiments so far, and there's been a lot of them, that we're typically seeing a 72% reduction in ammonia emissions from liquid nitrogen by adding NitroShield. And that's the same with nitrogen sulfur grades as well as with the pure nitrogen. The good news is that agronomically, this is a paying proposition as well. So rather than show you an awful lot of trials results, I've picked out a pertinent one from this last season. This was a trial conducted by Velcourt at Fine Farm Wendy in Cambridgeshire. In actual fact, there were a lot of treatments in this trial. They tried lots of different nitrogen rates, but it was clear from that that the optimum rate for yield on that field in that year was 180 kilos. So if we just look at that, what they did was split that 180 kilos into 2 applications, one in March, one in April. And they either put the fertilizer on alone, put NitroShield with it with the April application, which is what we're recommending under the Red Tractor option 4, or use NitroShield with both applications to see whether there's a benefit in that. What you'll see from this graph is that there was a yield benefit of around 0.4 of a tonne from the addition of NitroShield when we recommend it with the April application. And also the figure in black is grain protein. There was an increase in protein. Take those two together, that's a big increase in nitrogen use efficiency. But there was no additional benefit from using NitroShield with the March application, because in March this last year it was cool and wet. Really, the fertilizer got into the soil very quickly. There was no noticeable volatilization. And the outcome of that, it was a 14-to-1 return on investment. So even though that's a relatively modest yield increase, it's more than enough to fund the cost of the NitroShield. There was 10% improvement in nitrogen use efficiency, which we're all being targeted with now, and no additional benefit from routine application when not needed. So this is the reason why we're recommending NitroShield is supplied separately and added to the fertilizer when needed or after the 1st of April. So it's an agronomic decision. There's no benefit from having it with every single application. So supplying NitroShield to you separately has been proven to be the best policy, which fits with the whole principle of precision use of fertilizer, the right product in the right place at the right time, no wastage, so no unnecessary use, and the maximum effect and maximum return. Looking at independent trials that have been done previously with NBPT in 2016, 2017 in the UK, the sort of yield responses, they vary from year to year and trial to trial, but they're in that 0.3, 0.4 of a ton bracket. And trials in France have also seen small but noticeable increases in protein. So taking those two together, that's an improvement in nitrogen use efficiency. So this isn't just something that we have to do because the government wants us to do it to reduce pollution and has the obvious social benefit, but there is an agronomic benefit from doing it as well. We do get asked with these inhibitors about soil health because obviously soil health is very much in focus now. And it's a target that a lot of people are working towards to improve it. So does adding an inhibitor chemical to a liquid fertilizer harm the soil in any form or sorry, does adding an inhibitor to liquid nitrogen harm soil microbes? Well, there's already been one study conducted by Rothenstedt in the UK that said not, and perhaps more up to date, this was published just last year. Chuggas in Ireland have done a 5-year study on grassland in Wexford in Ireland, where they've used both urease inhibitors and nitrification inhibitors on the same land 5 years in a row, and they have measured no detectable effects on the micropopulation. And that shouldn't surprise us because, as I've already said, the inhibitor only works for a short period of time on a particular enzyme, and it breaks down very quickly into harmless ingredients. So the recommendations for NitroShield, we recommend 2 different rates. We're recommending 1 litre per cube or per 1,000 litres of fertilizer in low risk situations. And by that, we mean where soils are neutral or slightly acidic. You've got good crop canopy, so the soil surface is protected from drying out. The ambient temperature is relatively low, below 15 degrees, or you're expecting heavy rainfall. And in those circumstances, you can use 1 litre of NitroShield per 1,000 litres of fertilizer. But there is a higher rate or full rate of 1.25 litres. That's necessary where you're in high risk conditions. So alkaline soils, as I've already said, where you've got open crop canopy so the soil can dry out, got high temperatures, drying conditions. In those circumstances, you should be using the higher rate. And that's the same across the whole nitrogen sulfur range of fertilizers. So in summary then, NitroShield gives reliable reductions of over 70% in ammonia emissions when mixed with NitroFlow or NitroFlow S grades prior to application, and that conforms spot on to what DEFRA are asking us to do in terms of reducing ammonia emissions. We believe the choice whether to add or not should be made on the farm on the day. If you're after the 1st of April, then it will be compulsory under red tractor rules anyway. But it's worth bearing in mind that if we do have very warm, drying weather in March, it might also be worthwhile using in those circumstances or on very high pH soils. So NitroShield should be routinely used for all applications after the 31st of March, unless signed off as unnecessary under the red tractor rules by a fax qualified advisor. So if you've got some documentary proof, some written evidence that an assessment has been made. And the good news is that the additional cost of NitroShield will be more than covered by improved nitrogen use efficiency, higher yield, or if you like, the same yield with a reduced rate. So it really becomes a why wouldn't you instead of why would you? Thank you.